Hello, and welcome to a new episode of our podcast. I'm Margarida, and today hosting with me we have Giovanna. Uh, Today's episode is about hate speech in social media. To welcome our guest, Professor Raquel da Silva. She is an assistant professor in international relations at the University of Coimbra and an integrated researcher at the Center for International Studies. Her research has examined different forms of non-state violence, from terroristic violence to football violence, and recently she has started exploring different forms of state violence, such as counterterrorism and police brutality against racialized communities. And she is here today to provide expertise on the subject of hate speech, in particular considering the cyber dynamics that are very present in today's world. So, hello, Raquel. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thank you so much for your invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
So first of all, thank you for joining us. So the first question would be, so the topic of hate speech has been given some attention all over Western media recently, as it is a topic of controversy, due to the fact that the definition of hate speech is not agreed to in general consensus. So from this point of view, I would like to start off by asking, what is hate speech?
Okay, so usually hate speech refers to expressions that incite or promote or justify hatred, violence, discrimination against a person or a group based on certain characteristics. These characteristics can include race, religion, ethnicity, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, or other identity markers. So the core element then of hate speech is the intention to demean or harm or dehumanize a person or a group based on these identity markers, and creating an environment of fear and hostility for this person or this group of people. However, this is not a universal definition. There's actually quite a lot of controversy around the definition of hate speech. And this largely stems from the balance between freedom of expression, right, or freedom of speech, and the protection of individuals and groups from harm and discrimination, right? So this is like the main issue that really divides people, societies, governments when they define hate speech. And here, in the Western media and societies, we can already see this. We can already see how this balance is very often debated. For example, in different countries, different cultures have varying thresholds for what constitutes hate speech and how it should be regulated. So we can take two examples. We have the US on one side, which is a country with one of the strongest protections of free speech in the world. And this is guaranteed by the First Amendment of the US Constitution. So hate speech is frowned upon, but generally is legally protected unless it directly incites violence or imminent criminal activity. So there's a high threshold for the regulation of hate speech in the US. On the other side, you have Germany, where there are really stringent laws against hate speech, which reflects its history with the Holocaust. So denial of the Holocaust, speech inciting hatred against ethnic groups are illegal in Germany. So German law requires social media companies, for example, to remove hate speech promptly under threat of large fines. So here you can see, right, two examples of two countries where it's very different how they define and then how they regulate hate speech. So just to finish answering this question, I think it's just to it's important to bear in mind that this lack of a universal definition contributes to this ongoing debate about the limits of free speech and also the need to protect against harmful speech.
And so, how could we define what hate speech is in social media? Like, what is the distinguishing factor between other kinds of online discourse?
Mm-hmm. So, it is challenging, right, to define hate speech in social media, because hate speech has a very diverse and dynamic nature, particularly when it comes to the online interaction. Okay, so it's not an easy definition. However, if we want a more general definition, I think it needs to encompass certain things. And the first thing is that it targets specific groups. Okay, so it's not general speech, it's not general narrative for everyone out there, but often in social media involves derogatory, demeaning, or hostile language against certain individuals or groups based on characteristics such as the ones I already listed, like race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, gender, sexual orientation, disability, or other identity markers, right? So there needs to be a target person or group due to identity characteristics. And then there's also this intent to harm or incite harm, right? So the speech includes, incitations to violence, to discrimination, hatred against a particular person or group. And this can be like directly calling for actions of violence, right? Or more indirect calls or discriminatory speech, for example, using derogatory language for stereotypes against certain groups of people, right? And then obviously what social media do is to amplify everything, right? And to spread it very, very quickly. So social media enables that hate speech it's disseminated in a very widespread way. So it's not localized, it's not obscure, right? But really gains a big amplification. In social media, sometimes it's also difficult to understand what's hate speech and what's harassment or bullying, right? Because sometimes they often overlap online, especially when it's targeted at individuals and their identity or beliefs, right? So, for example, some academics are targeted for things that they write about, but then they pick on issues such as gender or sexual orientation of the researcher and not just what the person is writing about. So, and, commenting constantly on this person's posts on Twitter, for example, can kind of be both harassment and showcase forms of hate speech. So I think these are the main things that the definition of online hate speech should include.
And how does the anonymity of online platforms and algorithms contribute to the propagation of hate speech?
So sorry, I didn't hear the question very well.
How does the anonymity of online platforms and algorithms contribute to the propagation of hate speech?
Well, that's one of the big issues, right? Because so we have this figure nowadays of the keyboard warrior, right? Like if you Google it, you find all these, can be funny images or funny memos of, these usually men behind their keyboards kind of just saying whatever they want, as in these memes, right? Obviously, there's women doing that too. But anonymity or pseudonymity, right? People using different names just allows people to hide their real identities, right? And creates a sense that they can do anything because nobody knows who they are, right? So the kind of social desirability that usually plays in our social circles when we're talking, face to face with people, when people know our identities, just vanishes in this context, because people feel secure because nobody knows who they are, and this can kind of embolden individuals, right, to express hateful views without fear of real world consequences or accountability, right? So nobody knows who they are, they can simply just say whatever they want. However, we also find people with their real names and profiles doing that, right? So obviously this is an issue, right, that social media allows, but we also find, hate speech, unfortunately, open and by, people who identify themselves. And then the other thing with social media and, with the kind of IT world in general is what you mentioned regarding the algorithms and the phenomenon known as echo chambers, right? So obviously social media algorithms create these echo chambers by showing users content that aligns with their existing beliefs and interests. So we all know this, right? We all know that the things we are searching is what we keep seeing, or even what we're talking, depending on, how our house is set up in terms of technology, things start appearing, right? I just said I want to buy a pair of these specific boots, and now I only see, on my Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, adverts to these boots. The same to our beliefs and interests, right? So, and not just clothing interests, but also, more ideological interests. So what this algorithm creates is this, echo chamber, right? This place where we stay and we are surrounded and fed more of what we already believe. And obviously, if we have extreme views, and we are fed more of that. And we don't really come into contact with different views, right? So I teach a module, this term of terrorism and counterterrorism, and I keep telling this to the students, right? So we keep being fed our own narratives, right? So but we need to be aware of that. So I'm aware that in my social media, I see people who think like I do. Also, I tend to unfollow people, and I think, like myself, a lot of people that kind of, get on my nerves. And usually these are people who don't think like I do. And this is social psychology, right? We tend to do this. We tend to, go with people that think like us. I think so. So we've always done that, right? This was not created by social media, but social media just comes kind of exacerbate this, and the algorithms just feed this, which is not ideal, obviously, because we just stay in our own groups and categories, and we just keep our stereotypes and feed them, right? So, and basically algorithms, echo chambers, that's what they're doing. And then a third thing I would add here is the lack of effective moderation in social media platforms, right? So this is an area that we don't have that much information about, because platforms are very serious in keeping this information, right, in terms of how they moderate content. And so we would need more transparency from social media companies in that respect. But also we would need more moderation, I would say. So like the sheer volume of content, the content we have, and the complexity of the context we have makes it really challenging for social media platforms to effectively moderate hate speech. I understand that. I understand that it's really difficult to moderate this, also because of what I said in the beginning, the balance between freedom of speech and hate speech. And also there's then the AI human moderation, right? So can AI just moderate everything, or do they fail to actually recognize hate speech, for example? But then using human moderators, it's really difficult work too, because basically these people just sit in front of the computer and watch and read horrible things the whole day, day after day. So how's the mental health of the moderators too, right? So I think there's a lot of even ethical issues on the moderation of this content, right? But it is very important to kind of act as a gatekeeper for this kind of discriminatory speech.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much for so many great points. I think maybe going back a bit back to the echo chambers, we also know that social media and even news media often use clickbait as a form of fake news and just spreading disinformation. And this leads to people reacting in very expressive and over the top ways, because they get very emotionally involved and with some issues, and they maybe get very angry and very frustrated, and sometimes that can lead to an incident of hate speech just spread out on a Facebook post or a news post. So how can we really hold like these information channels and these newspapers or companies like Facebook and Twitter to prevent people from using hate speech in comments just open to everyone?
Yeah. Again, that's a complex issue, right? And it's a question that doesn't have like a direct answer. But I would say that we would need a combined approach of legal approach, right? But regulatory. So we actually need to regulate the platforms, but also social and technological. So it would be a combination of legal, regulatory, social, and technological approaches to this issue. So obviously we need legislation and regulation. So the platforms and usually governments that need to enact laws and regulations to hold social media companies and platforms accountable for the content on their websites, including hateful speech and content, right? So this would include, for example, that they need to remove this kind of hate speech comments, for example, within a certain time frame, or they would face penalties, right? Like, for example, Germany, which has a really strong legislation on that, right? So if this exists, then actually people can, bring them to justice, right? If we have laws, and a lot of the times the problem is that actually we don't, and then we can't complain, or there aren't the legal mechanisms to fight these issues. But if they are in place, then there can be litigation, right? So individuals can complain and can bring companies, for example, or platforms or whoever is allowing hate speech to flourish online, they can bring them to justice and try through legal action to solve that issue. As I was saying before, the platforms themselves need to have transparent policies, right? They need to enforce them, because sometimes it's not very clear. And I think for the normal user, it's not very clear, is this a problem, what I'm seeing, or is just someone expressing their opinion? But, can we express, for example, openly racist and xenophobic opinions online? I don't think it's very transparent, even for the people who would like to click the button that, like to kind of say, this is not the reporting button, right? But so I think if these policies would be transparent and advertised and clear for everyone, I think that would be a really big help, and it would also help to enforce things, right? Then obviously this would link to helping people to use, or kind of educate people on using reporting mechanisms. How should we use this? What is this for? But they should also be easy, right, to use. They shouldn't, take very long, because then again, people, or be too complex that not everyone can do it. Ideally, we would have some independent oversight, right? That is not just up to the businesses making money out of us being on social media, right? And but also have bodies that could review their decisions, provide transparency, and hold the companies accountable. But I also think it's very important pressure from a lot of places in society, like civil society who does like advocacy, public campaigns, it puts pressure right on the companies to be accountable and to be transparent in these issues. And also researchers, right, who tend to know what's happening and the kind of harm that hate speech causes. And they could also help. I think, this collaboration with experts could have a really big importance in helping not just understand hate speech and its impacts, but also how to handle it, right? Because there's quite a lot of research that people have done on how we can handle this through, for example, education campaigns, awareness campaigns. And above all, just adhere to ethical standards, right? Because this would, encourage, for example, media companies to, incorporate social responsibility principles in their documents, including respect for human rights, which I think is really what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
So you've given us some examples, from example, the German government regulations. What are the regulations by the EU to prevent hate speech from spreading online?
So the EU has implemented a lot of regulations, and it has also a lot of initiatives to prevent hate speech on social media and on other platforms. So a few that I can think of. So for example, there's this Audiovisual Media Services Directive from 2018, which includes, for example, provisions for video sharing platforms, like, for example, YouTube, right? So it requires member states to ensure that these platforms have measures to protect the users from content inciting violence or hatred, right? Particularly based on race, religion, nationality, or sexual orientation, right? So this is something, a regulation just for videos. Then there's also the Code of Conduct on Countering Illegal Hate Speech Online. This was launched a bit before. It was launched in 2016 and is a voluntary code agreed by major IT companies, including Facebook, X, former Twitter, YouTube, and Microsoft. And here they have committed to review and, if necessary, remove illegal hate speech within 24 hours of being notified. And again, this was an EU initiative. Then more recently, we have the Digital Services Act. This was proposed in 2020. And this one aims to create a safer digital space where fundamental rights and use of the users are protected. So one of the objectives of the Digital Services Act is to address illegal content online, which includes hate speech, by establishing clear responsibilities for the digital service providers. So again, kind of placing part of the responsibility in the social media platforms. Something else that is very important, and Margarida has worked on this and has used it in her own research, is the EU Action Plan Against Racism that takes the period from 2020 to 2025. This plan includes specific measures to combat racism and xenophobia, including online hate speech. It focuses on law enforcement and judicial responses, along with funding and support for civil society organizations. This is a very interesting, very promising plan that, a lot of people saw it as something very positive put forward by the EU. And finally, something else that comes to my mind is a bit older than all of this, but it was established in 2015 and is the EU Internet Forum. This forum brings together different EU institutions, member states, internet companies to combat online terrorism and hate speech. So here it promotes voluntary cooperation to reduce the accessibility of this content. So I think these are some examples of regulations and initiatives that reflect the EU's commitment to balancing the protection of freedom of speech and the need to combat hate speech and illegal content online. And if you kind of analyze all this, you'll see that they emphasize collaboration between governments, tech companies, and civil society, and also continue to evolve in response to new challenges and technological developments, which sometimes is the big issue, right? Is that like we can't just, launch these initiatives, but then these things evolve really quickly. And sometimes we're just running after this kind of changes and evolutions. But I would think these are, some examples of the EU has been doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those are even the oldest initiative you mentioned is from 2015, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. It's still pretty recent, which kind of poses the question of how we can put it in parallel with the far right rising in Europe, and how maybe hate speech is sometimes often said by representatives of far right parties that have been growing since the last decade, maybe. In the recent years, they really have been gaining more and more space in the political sphere. So, for instance, in the case of Portugal, we have Chega constantly attacking the Roma community, making it very clear that what they say about the Roma community consists of hate speech. So I think the question we would like to have your opinion on is, what is the real impact of hate speech in marginalized communities? How does this affect the people?
Yeah. So something I kind of touched it in the first question, but I think I should have made it more clear, is that hate speech online and offline, but we're talking here mostly of the online space, is very contextual, right? Is something that is fed by the context. So if there is polarization, ideological polarization, political polarization in the context, and so if we have, as you were saying, this kind of politicians, making themselves offering examples of hate speech online or offline through the media and so on, this kind of legitimates this behavior, right? So if a politician is doing it, and in Portugal, but also abroad, it's quite similar. We even see a spike in hate crimes after that kind of thing, right? Like if a politician of, a member of the, a political member or something, someone recognized, right, public figure, says something of this kind online, we see a spike in hate crimes. So it's very linked to this context. And we don't only see a spike in hate crimes, but then we also have the consequences. And your question, I think, goes in that direction, right? What's the consequences for the targeted populations? So I think there's quite a lot of consequences, and sometimes we don't even think about, all of them. We just see some, like the most clear ones. But so I would start by saying that, has a very big effect on the mental health of this population. So there's a real harm to the mental health of the people targeted by hate speeches, because it can lead to significant psychological distress, to anxiety, to depression, even to post-traumatic stress disorder. It can also lead to feelings of fear, right, of encountering the people or going to certain places where they will, be victims of this kind of behavior, but also anger for what's happening to them, and at the same time helplessness. So it seems like is everything, right, together. But if we think, well, this kind of situation, like if we try to put ourselves in the shoes of victims of hate crime and hate speech, that's the kind of thing. We can have fear that it doesn't happen to that it might happen to us again, but also this sense of anger for there are people like that say things like that, and helplessness because we don't know where to go for help or how to stop this, right? So and then it also has this cumulative effect, right, of constant exposure, particularly online, right? We can be, and in the news, and particularly around specific events in specific context, which this constant exposure can also have effects in the long term in people's mental health, but also intergenerational effects. So we've been, now recently talking a lot about intergenerational effects of trauma. And research has been showing that this is a real thing and affects the future mental health and social integration of communities, right? And I think hate speech also plays a very big role in this kind of harm. So then we also have a little bit related, but also different, because so this was more the kind of mental health, psychological side of people's lives. But then we actually have actual social isolation and stigmatization caused by hate speech. So because it reinforces stereotypes, reinforces prejudices that we all have, right? But this kind of hate speech will just reinforce it towards certain groups, obviously. Will lead to social isolation, where members of these groups will feel unwelcome or unsafe in certain spaces, both online and offline. Hate speech can also silence their voices, right, and marginalize their communities in general. It will lead them to be less engaged in public discourse, for example, less keen to share their opinions, less keen to participate in social media platforms. And this is a form of censorship, right, of their contributions and of their perspectives, right? And sometimes there's people who go like and say, oh, well, again, another, roundtable of white, middle class, middle-aged men, right? And like, so you don't have representation most of the time. And you complain, and you're even victim of hate speech yourself, just for, raising this fact. Mm-hmm. But sometimes, and but people are invited and they don't want to come. Yes, because they are protecting themselves, right? Because these are not safe spaces for everyone. So I even believe that people are invited, but even me as a woman, I'm very careful with the kind of invitations I accept, and I have a lot of privilege, right? But yeah, so it's this kind of thing that people really think about when participating, right? So it's the censoring of people's participation. So obviously, hate speech will erode the social fabric in these ways, right? Will deepen divisions, will increase hostility between different groups in society, and undermine, efforts of inclusivity, of respect, of cohesion in the communities. And obviously, there's another very, real issue of physical violence, right? Of actually hate speech leading to hate crimes, right, or to forms of physical violence that puts people's safety in question. And again, that's something very serious, right, that we've witnessed in Portugal and abroad, these cases. So it's something real, where hate speech will almost like normalize violence, will, legitimize violent action against this, against certain groups. And then there's all the others. I know I'm giving a really long answer because there's a lot of consequences. But we can also not forget access to education, to health, to justice, right? That we have research that shows that there's lack, or there's lower access to these places, and even when there's access, that the way people are treated is very often different, right? So, for example, the stories we have, or not stories, research we have regarding medical violence, for example, against racialized communities, or certain groups of victims going to the police and being ignored or not really listened to, or they don't feel they're being listened to, right? So yeah, I think these are some of the consequences that hate speech has on marginalized communities.
Your answer was very informative. It was very interesting. And as you have mentioned, politicians and governments can cause a real impact on the increase in hate speech, especially against minorities. Could you tell us more about to what extent do you think that hate speech might be a leading factor of hate crimes?
So I think this influence of hate speech in hate crimes cannot be underestimated. So it's something that actually happens. However, it's very complex again and very multifaceted, right? There's different issues at play here. So I think, first of all, as I already said, but I think it's important to underline, hate speech contributes to the normalization and legitimization of hostility against certain groups, right? And particularly if this comes from public figures and, people with a seat in parliament, right? That's the kind of, legitimation and normalization. When this goes unchecked, right? When this is like, okay, it can create an environment where prejudice and bigotry are seen as acceptable, right? So we can now go on TV or on the newspapers or on social media and simply say whatever we think, even if it is racist and xenophobic and discriminatory. And this can potentially lead, as I already said, to an increase in hate crimes, right? And we have, a ton of stories around Europe, just to focus in Europe, of this kind of thing, right? Like politicians making derogatory comments and then hate crimes going up the next day or in the next few hours. So in some cases, we also have hate speech that is explicitly or implicitly encouraging violence or discrimination against specific groups, right? So the speech can act as a catalyst, mobilizing individuals to commit hate crimes based on the beliefs or biases expressed in the speech, okay? Persistent hate speech, so something that is constant, can create a climate of fear and tension within communities because it can escalate existing conflicts and tensions, increasing again the likelihood of hate crimes, right? So it's again that normalization through the persistence of the hate speech. And then obviously the online platforms, particularly the ones that create the echo chambers, right? Through the algorithm, we just see what we are used and what kind of feeds our own views. This accelerates the spread of the hate speech, and it can radicalize people, can radicalize individuals, leading to a heightened risk of hate crime, because individuals become more deeply entrenched in their ideologies, which goes unquestioned and unchecked because it's just fed by what they're seeing in their echo chamber. However, so all this said, so I think, there is a relationship here, but the impact of hate speech on hate crimes is also influenced by broader societal factors, right? So we always need to put this into context. For example, the political climate, if there's social unrest, even the economic conditions, right, that the country is going through. For example, in times of societal stress, hate speech can more readily translate into hate crimes, right? Because these tensions are already heightened. However, it's important to note that not all hate speech directly leads to hate crime, and not all hate crimes are directly precipitated by hate speech, right? So we do not have here a causation or a causal relationship, and it's important also to know that and to just bear that in mind. So the relationship is often quite indirect. Hate speech contributes to this society atmosphere that condones or even encourages violence against certain groups. So if we address hate speech effectively, it will require a comprehensive approach that include, as I already said, legal measures, educational efforts, community engagement, responsibility from the tech companies, the social media, the media platforms, to altogether reduce the harmful impact of hate speech and the likelihood of it leading to hate crimes.
Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you so much for joining us during that discussion of hate speech in social media. We hope that you found the episode interesting also. And we would love to get our comment on today's episode. As always, thanks for listening to our podcast. And just a last remark is that this episode was co-founded by the European Union through the Erasmus Plus project Songs for Change.
Thank you.
Thank you.